Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Filled full with Brahman are the things we see. Filled full with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman floweth all. Yet is it still the same. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace. Good morning. The topic today is conscious living. When you first hear that title, you might think, conscious living. Well, isn't that kind of redundant? We're living. Of course we're living. We're aware of it. Doesn't that make us conscious? It's just our normal experience. And I don't think anybody here would deny that. So this is what we're going to look at this morning. First of all, in the waking state, we find that the body and the mind are constantly engaged in some sort of activity. The body is engaged, and the mind, in things that we must do, our duties, our responsibilities, our routines. And sometimes they're engaged in doing the things that we choose to do. Sometimes we feel maybe we're doing nothing at all, but really, are we? The body and the mind are still functioning. They're still engaged in the act of existing. So even then, we are aware that we are alive. Aware, yes, but how knowingly aware? That is the question. The body can be active, or seemingly it can be at rest. The mind, in contrast, always seems to be busy. It's all caught up with perceiving the sights, the sounds, the colors, the shapes, and all else that make up sensory experience. It becomes stimulated by these things, and then it tries to make sense of them. How do all these perceptions relate to each other? What do they mean? What do they mean to me personally? We might even be drawn to ask, what can I learn from them? That pretty much explains how we are at the moment, in the here and now. But what about before? What about all the things that happened in the past? How often do we find that the mind itself strays to those past events, or at least to memories of those past events, and that it allows them to color the present moment, either with pleasant or painful emotions that we may have experienced in the past? So I think besides the engagement with the here and now, the mind also is busy resurrecting its recollections of the past. And it goes in the other direction too. The mind can jump ahead to an imagined future or an anticipated future, wondering what's going to happen, what might not happen. And so at every moment, it seems like our awareness is a jumble of past, present, and future. And this pretty much accounts for ordinary human awareness. Now, can we call this conscious living? Even when we are somewhat focused on the present, can we truly call that conscious living? You might notice that in our mundane, everyday lives, sometimes we get by with a minimum of attentiveness. So if we are not present-minded, in a sense we have to say that we are absent-minded. And this results from a failure to pay sufficient attention. And the failure to pay attention sometimes has its consequences. Just to give a very trivial example of this, let's say you're watching a mystery show on TV, and it's a really interesting one that you're engrossed in, but you let your mind wander for a moment or two, and then when it comes back, you might have missed something very important. Mystery shows have a way of putting out clues here and there for you to direct you towards a solution. You may have missed one of those. Or suddenly, maybe there's a new character on the screen, somebody you didn't remember from before. Where did that person come from? What does he or she mean to the story? From this moment on, you haven't a clue. You're at a decided disadvantage. And it's all because of those few seconds that you allowed your attention to drift away. This is a moment of absent-mindedness. Now, the seers of the Upanishads noticed this 3,000 years ago. We find in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where the seer says, people have been known to say, my mind was elsewhere, I did not see it. My mind was elsewhere, I did not hear it. Even if somebody touches us on the back, that may be gone by unnoticed because my mind was elsewhere. So our experience of life is formed by the mind. And if this touch of the back goes unnoticed by the mind, that means for the sake of our experience, it never happened, even though it did. And so our daily lives are shaped not only by what we are aware of, but also by what we are not aware of. Now and then we might ask ourselves, am I missing something? Am I not getting the full picture? What would a fuller picture even be like? These kinds of questions spark our curiosity now and then, and they might even motivate us to seek answers. For some of us, those answers lie in spiritual guidance. And here I'll read a paragraph from the Vedanta Society's monthly bulletin. Vedanta teaches that humanity's real nature is divine, that the true object of human life is to unfold and manifest this divinity, and that truth is universal. Vedanta accepts all the religions of the world and reveres the great prophets, teachers, and incarnations of God, because it recognizes the same divine inspiration in all. Now, in practice, Vedanta adheres to the ancient principle that spiritual transmission is given directly from the guru to the disciple. This is the way it was in the age of the Upanishads, and this is the way it is even today, thousands of years later. From this we can gather that religion is, in the Vedantic view, not merely a matter of belief, but a matter of conviction, born of our own experience. Now sometimes those experiences come to us spontaneously, seemingly out of nowhere. But more often than not, we gain these experiences, these insights, through dedicated practice. And so accordingly, the Vedanta societies around the country offer private instruction to those devotees who are sincere and wish to follow the path of meditation. Let's say that you've been initiated, you follow your guru's instructions. Every day you set about the recommended amount of time to do your spiritual practice, your meditation, and it becomes an important part of your routine. Many of us have spent years doing this. But this raises another question, and one that we don't always ask, and that is, what about when we're not meditating? If I meditate an hour a day, what am I doing the rest of the time? And this matters because the rest of the time is, in fact, most of the time. Now, meditation teaches us to look inward. The Guru instructs us to sit quietly, comfortably, calmly, in quiet surroundings, and then to close our eyes to the distractions of the world. We're probably given some instruction to focus our attention on an idea of the deity or a spiritual principle, a divine principle shining within the heart. But usually when we sit to do this, the first thing we encounter is the activity of the mind. With experience and discipline, gradually we learn to turn that activity into focus. Focus on the object of meditation. And that in turn can lead us to higher states of awareness. That, in theory, is how meditation works. But life is complicated. I'd like to recount an incident that happened in the Hollywood Temple many, many years ago. One evening, a devotee asked Swami Prabhavananda. She said that when she was at the temple, either attending a lecture or a class or a puja, or even just being there in that holy atmosphere, she said everything in her life felt so right. But on leaving, all of that feeling evaporated, and everything went back to the way it just was. Is there a way, she asked the Swami, to take the experience of this place with me back to my life out there? Let's broaden that question. when we are not turned inward to the shrine of the heart, when we are not meditating, when we are out there going through all the motions of our daily existence, do we have to leave that higher consciousness behind? Or can we develop a way in which some measure of spiritual awareness flows outward into our normal activities? Can we arrive at a state of conscious living? The purpose of meditation is not escapism. This is something we must understand from the outset. Yes, it is a temporary withdrawal from the ups and downs of the world, all the activity, the distractions, but the goal of meditation is not escape, and it is not oblivion. Swami Prabhupada used to stress that meditation is not about making the mind a blank. If that's what you want, he used to say, then have someone hit you over the head with a brick. When the activity of consciousness subsides, consciousness does not go away. In fact, to the contrary, it shines forth more brightly in its own being. The activity within consciousness, all of our thoughts, our perceptions, our ideas, our distractions, our memories, all of that activity within consciousness is the obscuring factor. And so the purpose of meditation is to put that obscuring activity to rest, so that the light of consciousness, the light of the self, may shine through more brightly. Meditation is about experiencing a fuller consciousness. And at some point we will come to understand this, that even the outer world is made of consciousness. It is an expression of that same divine consciousness that we're seeking deep within ourselves. Consciousness flows outward into the manifest, dynamic panorama of becoming. And that also flows back inward towards its own true nature, at rest at its changeless, self-luminous being. The true benefit of meditation is not a few minutes of respite away from the clamor of the world, although we certainly would not say that that's not worth having. But more importantly, that brief time is an experience of awareness from a higher vantage point, or at least it gives us the opportunity of that experience. So again, can that higher awareness accompany us when we come out of meditation and when we engage back with the world again? We can ask ourselves, do we see things in a clearer light? Do we find that our relationship with the world has improved because of our meditation? Change comes from within, from our own inner experience, and it is very private. A guru will usually tell the disciple, there is no need to tell others about this. In fact, it would be a betrayal of something that should be very intimate. And so talking about your inner experiences only dispels their transformational force. It is to our benefit to keep quiet. And if any improvements happen in our personalities, they'll become apparent to others without our saying a word. Is there a methodology for conscious living? Are there steps we can follow, things that we can do? It all comes down to the fact that it is based on paying attention. Conscious living involves paying attention. It's interesting because we recognize readily the need to focus when we are meditating, but we also need that same one-pointed awareness for the rest of the time when we are not meditating, when we're engaged in our daily lives. So conscious living is to be awake to what is going on around us, as well as to what is going on inside of us, and also to how we react to what is going on around us. All too often, which means usually, we rely on established patterns of stimulus and response. And then we deal with every situation automatically, as if we've been pre-programmed to do this. In fact, we have programmed ourselves, and that is the problem. In daily living, we need an enhanced awareness of our surroundings. And we also need an enhanced awareness of what is going on inside of us, beyond this perpetual habituality that takes us through each day. We need to look beyond our thoughts and feelings. We have to go deeper and become mindful of the workings of the mind itself. We need to go beyond the what in order to discover the how and the why. Now, sometimes when we're talking about principles and concepts, it's helpful to imagine some sort of model that we can visualize. So here's a model to start with. If we make a distinction between the time we're meditating and the time we're not meditating, isn't that a little like going back and forth from one box to another? Do we compartmentalize our lives in this way? With one area for spiritual discipline and another area for the not so spiritual? Maybe we do this in the beginning. But what is to be gained from repeatedly climbing out of one box and jumping into another? Something is not right with this model, and here's why. The Upanishads teach that the innermost self, the Atman, is Brahman, and they also teach that Brahman is consciousness itself. Because consciousness, Brahman, is by its very nature singular and undivided, it cannot be split up and put into separate boxes. In deep meditation, we have a purer state of wholeness of consciousness. Yes, we do. Much more so than in everyday living, where our awareness is fragmented and diversified. But in truth, both are experiences of consciousness. And without that consciousness, there would be no awareness of anything at all. In fact, there would be nothing at all. The Tantras teach that Brahman is the infinite oneness that excludes nothing. And Sri Ramakrishna had a really good example to illustrate this principle. It's the image of the bell fruit. This is also known as the Bengali quince. He said, if you retain only the sweet, edible flesh of the fruit, you are not getting the full weight. He said the fruit consists of the sweet, edible flesh, yes, but also there is the skin and the seeds. The sweet, edible flesh is the essence, Brahman, consciousness in itself. The skin is the outermost manifestation, the appearance of the world, consciousness appearing as the creation. And the seeds within are that eternal potentiality for creativity, for expression. And so Sri Ramakrishna said this, the three together, the flesh, the skin, the seeds, constitute the full weight. Now, since consciousness is one and indivisible, this model of the continuum will work better than the model of the boxes. At one end of this continuum, we have our ordinary waking awareness with all its apparent distinctions of name, form, quality. And all of these obscure the light somewhat, so the light is dim. At the other end, we have the state of enlightenment, the light shining forth in full glory, unitary consciousness, shining in the joy of its own boundlessness. And so we have this continuum where consciousness is present everywhere, either from the end where it is dimmed down or the end where it's shining in its full brightness. And in our ordinary experience, we're down towards the dim end of the continuum. We think we are this and that. We are interacting with all manner of thises and that's. But what we fail to recognize is that we and all the thises and that's are nothing but consciousness itself. The continuum also implies the idea of motion, moving along the continuum. Consciousness flows. Where the mind can be pinpointed at any given moment along this continuum will determine how bright or dim our awareness is. When we sit to meditate, what we're trying to do is to move out of that dim area towards the inner brightness, towards the knowledge of our true nature. This model works better than the boxes, but if you stop to think about it a little, you'll find that when we have gradations of light, this still suggests an either-or way of thinking, brighter or dimmer. And this either-or way of thinking is not so easy to overcome because it is so pervasive in our experience and so ingrained in us. So we can ask, is there a way to undermine this either-or way of thinking? And here we can draw a nice example from Shaiva teaching. Shaiva teaching explains that the emanation and withdrawal of the universe are a cosmic process that takes place within divine consciousness. They are actually two phases of a single process. And this process is also reflected at the level of human awareness, in my mind, in your mind, in everybody's mind. These two phases, the emanation and the withdrawal, are called Unmesha and Nimesha. Unmesha means the opening of the eyes. When Shiva opens his eyes, he manifests the phenomenal universe. Nimesha means the closing of the eyes. When Shiva closes his eyes, he withdraws the creation. Similarly, at our human level, when we awaken from sleep and open our eyes, the world becomes present to us. And when we close our eyes and go into deep sleep, the world vanishes. Okay, that's only half the story. Shaiva teaching also observes that to open the eyes to the diversity of the surrounding world is simultaneously to close them to the essential unity within. And to close the eyes to the diversity of the surrounding world is to open them to that essential oneness that is our true nature. So here our absolutist either-or way of thinking begins to erode. And this is something we can remember when we try to practice conscious living, to go beyond this sense of either-or. This movement of consciousness can also be described in two other Sanskrit words. Nivritti means the inward flow of consciousness. Pravritti means the outward flow. When we meditate, we practice nivritti. We want the inward flow of consciousness to take us toward the self within. And when we emerge from meditation, the pravritti is the flow of consciousness that takes us back and connects us with the world outside. Being connected with this outer world is a perfectly natural and indispensable part of being alive. So when we talk about the world, we should not confuse this with worldliness. The world and worldliness are two separate things. The world is the environment in which we live. Worldliness is an attitude based on the pursuit of pleasure in that environment. Now, we consider that the flow goes in two directions. And certainly, we do not want to take all the distractions of our daily living inward with us to our meditative state. But don't we want to take the calmness, the brightness, the insight, the clarity of meditation back out into our daily lives? I think we do. So the first step in this practice would be to observe the mind. Watch the mind. But what happens when we do this? Usually we find we are not watching the mind itself. We're observing the content of the mind. We're observing whatever is present at the moment. And the content consists of more than just the sense perceptions, the seeing, the hearing, the tasting, the smelling, the touching. It also consists of the thoughts, feelings, and ideas that arise inwardly in response to what's going on outside, or inwardly as a recollection of something that has happened in the past. So instead of being involved with the contents and taking them as the determining factors of our reality, we need to go deeper. We need to observe content as content, to see it for what it really is. If you think now about all the people in your lives, the places, the objects, the conditions, and the events, ask yourself, are you experiencing them? Or are you experiencing your thoughts about them? Your whole experience of the world takes place within the mind. And how would you characterize those thoughts? Are they clear and dispassionate? Or are they all entangled and colored by the multiple lenses of your experience? To the extent that we can recognize the contents of the mind as content, they will loosen their grip. The next step is to observe the actual working of the mind. The content changes constantly, but the capacity to experience the content is always there, independent and unaffected by it. And this capacity to experience the content, the ability to look at that, leads to a deeper sense of awareness, of consciousness per se, that underlines all of these particular experiences within consciousness. If at this point we gain some glimmer of understanding, of a deeper understanding, our view of the world will be unaltered in unimaginable ways, and we will emerge from this place of introspection with a heightened awareness. We will feel less affected by the ups and downs of everyday life, and at the same time, paradoxically, we will feel more fully alive in the moment. During the many waking hours when we are not engaged in actual meditation, yes, we can elevate our awareness to a level that reveals a spiritual dimension in every moment. This is exactly what we are taught in the opening words of the Isha Upanishad. Isha vasyam idam sarvam yat kimcha jagatyam jagat. All this, whatever moves in this moving world, is to be steeped in God. This verse tells us that we must cultivate a constant mindfulness of the divine presence in every aspect of life. The divine presence is always there, that goes without saying, but we rarely notice. And this verse from the Upanishad tells us why we rarely notice. It calls the world idam sarvam, all this. All this means that the minds are too enthralled by the sheer magnitude of all this grand panorama all around. It claims our attention in so many ways. And then if that were not enough, all this is jagat, that which moves. Everything, including our mind that is perceiving it, is in constant motion. So the Upanishad tells us, steep everything in your everyday experience in constant reminders of something higher. First, we have to acknowledge the physical world. And this is very interesting. Vedanta teaches that ultimately everything is one. Everything is Brahman. Everything is consciousness. It follows that both in our spiritual practice and in our daily lives, we should not oppose the divide between the secular and the sacred, or between matter and spirit. Swami Prabhavananda used to like to recount a lesson that he learned as a young monk. He and a fellow disciple were discussing whether spiritual visions were even possible in the physical plane. Their guru, Swami Brahmananda, overheard the conversation and confronted them. And Swami said, "But Maharaj, how can one see God in the external world with physical eyes?" And Maharaj answered him in English. He said, "Show me the line of demarcation where matter ends and spirit begins." This is a good teaching. It reminds us not to think of the divine as otherworldly. The Ishopanishad says all this is to be steeped in God. The Chandogya Upanishad takes it one step further and says, Sarvam kalvidam Brahma. All this world is surely Brahman. If so, signs of spiritual truth should be all around us. But most of the time we are so caught up with the outside world, and even more so what's going on inside of our heads, that we fail to notice. We are not truly observant. One of the secrets to conscious living is to step back and be the witness. Our consciousness is not going to transform itself overnight, but we can begin doing this moment by moment, and once we begin, we find that we can inculcate this habit. When we step back and just observe, everything immediately becomes simpler. When we let go of active involvement with the contents of consciousness, with everything going on in our minds, we can watch dispassionately. The world does not go away. but we see it with a clearer awareness. The Svetashvatara Upanishad declares, "The one God hidden in all beings and pervading everything is the soul of all creatures. Overseeing the universe, dwelling in all beings, he is the witness, the perceiver, and the absolute, devoid of all qualities." We do not see beyond the veil of our own conscious activity, our involvement with everything that comes before the mind. But if we accept Svetashvatara's teaching, then we can come to realize that everything is the dwelling place of the divine reality. And if so, then everything deserves our respect. The joy of recognizing that God lives in us and that we live in God awakens in us the ideals of reverence, appreciation, gratitude, and compassion. It opens our eyes to a sanctified vision of life. In this sense, the world can be our teacher. Sri Krishna tells of this in the Uddhava Gita, which is the 11th book of the Bhagavata Purana. Here he tells a story of King Yadu and the young holy man who lives in a state of spiritual freedom. The king wants to know the young holy man's secret, and the holy man explains that he gained lessons from observing the world around him. He said he had 24 teachers, and he gives each one as an example. We're going to look at the first 5, because these are the elements of the physical universe: earth, water, fire, air, and space. From the element of earth, the holy man learned that the denseness of physical matter represents stability. It gives us the example to remain steady at all times. And then if we look at the earth as the planet revolving in its orbit, we find that it does not deviate from that orbit. And so the holy man said we must remain true to our course, resolved to remain poised even in the face of disturbance from others. And then finally with the earth, he said, look how the earth brings forth nourishment for all living beings. Our lives should also be lived selflessly so that they bring benefit to others. When we think of the element of water, we think of clarity, purity, and the power to cleanse. Physically, water washes away dirt and impurities. Beyond the physical, we need to purify our thoughts by deciding what is acceptable and beneficial, and by metaphorically washing away what is not. As you think, so you become. This is a teaching known to all the religious traditions of the world. And then beyond even the idea of purity, we have clarity. And clarity of mind gives access to right understanding. It opens the door to those glorious visions. When we think of the element of fire, I would suggest we think of the English word ardor. Ardor comes from the Latin word for flame. And ardor means light, brilliance, splendor, but also enthusiasm. And the word enthusiasm comes from the Greek. It means a state of being in God, and theos, a state of divine inspiration. So spiritual life should be fueled by enthusiasm, because the higher self is ananda, joy. And then the holy man also points out that fire consumes. And so this spiritual ardor, called tapas in Sanskrit, burns away the impurities of ignorance. The holy man mentioned that air moves about but remains unaffected by anything that it comes into contact with, pleasing or displeasing. And we should move among life's objects and circumstances in the same way, untouched by good or evil. And finally, we perceive space as the vastness of the sky, appearing to go on endlessly. And this can be a visible reminder of Brahman. It can bring to us a glimmer of insight that our own higher self, like the all-pervading space, is everywhere present and everywhere the same. It would be absurd to think that these 5 physical elements talked to the holy man and imparted their message. The message came through his own receptivity, through his own attentive observation, which allowed to arise within his mind an awareness of these teachings. So we too can let that higher awareness enhance our experience of the ordinary world. The answers are reflected all around us. They are already within us. It's only a matter of seeing what is already there, of being present-minded. That said, life is more than looking. A large part of life is doing. Even meditation entails doing. So let's begin there. Spiritual practice requires dedicated effort. But what do the words practice and effort mean? Spiritual practice is not doing the same thing over and over again repetitively until we get it right. If that is our frame of reference for meditation, then spiritual practice becomes little more than a performance. It becomes like our familiar daily activities where we have programmed our bodies and our minds to go through all the motions almost unthinkingly without present-mindedness. Spiritual practice can sink to the same level. So instead of this idea of repetitive motion, routine, spiritual practice should be approached with a spirit of adventure. We should be alive to the moment because we frankly don't know what lies ahead. And what about effort? The Sanskrit word is prayatna. And prayatna means being active, being persevering, diligent, eager, devoted, and mindful. It also implies the idea of volition, will, of engaging because we want to. And so, effort should be looked upon as a constellation of positive attitudes and mental activities. And another important thing is that effort is not about resisting. To resist with something is to engage actively with it. And if you're engaged actively with an obstacle, where is your mind? Focused on the obstacle, not focused on the goal. The Bhagavad Gita teaches that our very nature as human beings will force us to act. The secret is how to act. Sri Krishna taught Arjuna that we live in the domain of action. Acting is a natural part of human existence. But we should not be caught up in the trap of expecting results. But you might say, we live in a world of cause and effect. Isn't it true that a certain action will produce a certain result? And yes, it will. But here's where dispassion comes in. Whatever the task, we must not become distracted. Think about doing something. What happens when you're thinking about how it will turn out? How much longer it'll take? How well you're doing it? What others will think? What results you'll get out of it? Where's your mind? Your mind is diverted. Your attention and energy are drawn away from the task at hand. It may appear that you are trying too hard, but in fact, you're not giving it all you've got. So our attention and energy are divided and compromised. The secret of work is that work should be performed for its own sake, to the best of our ability. Then there's the alternative of doing nothing. And Sri Krishna basically says, well, that's simply not an option. As long as you live, you will be engaged in acting, if not physically, then mentally and emotionally. It's interesting to consider that successful meditation and successful action both depend on the same thing. Both depend on making the mind one-pointed. Both depend on focusing attention solely on the matter at hand and giving it all you've got. The glorious paradox in such moments is that we're scarcely aware of being involved at all. The highest effort is in fact effortless. Being involved is not the same as being present. As a matter of fact, they're as different as night and day. Being involved leads to an increased sense of bondage, whereas being present as the witness empowers us to observe without reacting or judging. And this enhances our sense of freedom. In the stillness of equanimity, deeper insights, along with feelings of wonder, will arise. Until we can cultivate this present-mindedness, we have to deal with something called expectation. The Bhagavad Gita has already touched on this, but Sri Krishna has much more to say about it in the Uddhava Gita. This again is where the young holy man instructed the king. And here's another one of his teachers. Long ago, in the city of Videha, there lived a courtesan named Pingala. One evening, decked out in all her finery, she stood as usual at her door, ready to receive any chance lover. Greedy for wealth, she watched the men who passed by, looking upon each as a possible source of gain. Many passed by, untempted by her beauty, while she waited at the door until long past midnight. Finally, tired and impatient, she felt within herself a deep disgust and recognized her own folly. I've truly been a fool to expect happiness from false lovers. In my ignorance, I've been running after unworthy creatures who cannot fulfill my longing, even while neglecting the true lover who dwells in my own heart. In him, the nearest of the near, are true delight and immeasurable wealth. Needlessly have I afflicted my soul by this detestable livelihood, hoping to gain wealth and pleasure. Surely the Lord has shown me his grace, since out of the disappointment has arisen this great joy. Henceforth, satisfied with whatever I have, I shall delight in the company of him who is none other than my own self. The holy man summed up this teaching saying, expectation is the source of the worst misery, and freedom from expectation is the source of supreme happiness. Whenever we form an expectation, we are imposing a condition or a set of conditions on our experience, and more often than not, we are setting ourselves up for disappointment. If we tie our well-being to something we wish to happen, or perhaps not to happen, in the future, we can never be fully present in the now. Expectation leaves us constantly unsettled, and when we are unsettled, we have lost our focus. The story of the courtesan tells us also that good can come out of adversity. Pingala's frustration, born of expectation, led to her spiritual awakening. And that awakening happened only when she stopped trying. Through the exercise of her own selfish will, she created her own misery. But when she let go, her misery was removed by unconditional divine grace. So, in the end, our misery and our happiness are all a matter of will and grace. I guess nobody here watches TV. Besides observing the world and acting in the world, there's the question of how much of the world involves our relationships with other people. Now, this is probably a topic for a year's worth of talks. It's very complex and it has variations beyond number. But all we have time for is a few fundamental points. First, let's begin with the premise that understanding ourselves is essential to understanding others. Let's look below the surface of the human personality. We'll find that there are two principles at work: ignorance and curiosity. Ignorance means not knowing. And this has a wide range of meaning. Ignorance can be lacking information about specific matters, and we all have this in certain areas. Or ignorance can be that overarching, primal unawareness of our true nature, of who we are. On the plus side, ignorance sparks curiosity. Curiosity motivates us to direct our attention. It can be directed towards anything or anyone that we want to know more about. Curiosity also reminds us that there is always more to know. Spiritual curiosity, then, can be an important driving force. It can lead us to examine our own sense of individuality. Our sense of individuality depends on the primal ignorance of our true being, having forgotten that we are Brahman. We think we are these individual selves. And the self-awareness of the human personality is a compounded identity. It's made up of so many different factors that we identify with and claim as our own. The human personality, that sense of self, is a highly conditioned and multidimensional experience. And it obscures the higher spiritual consciousness that is the true self. At the same time, that true self, that one undivided consciousness, remains the only constant throughout this transitory play of life, whether we're aware of it or not. Think of the conditioned consciousness that we individuals mistake as our identity, and then go on to project outward at every moment. Think of how our internal assumptions about everything color the way we relate to everyone else. The ingredients of my personality might differ from yours, or his, or hers, or theirs. But these are all superficial details, deeper within. Apart from this mix of ingredients, in every one of us, the operative dynamics are the same. What is true of me internally is true of the person in front of me. Each experience, each person, each one of us experiences the personal self as the central point of reference for the entire universe. I am at the middle of the universe and everybody else is out there. And every one of you can say the same thing. So I see myself as the subject, and I see everyone else as an object of my experience. I fail to recognize that each object experiences himself or herself as the subject, and me and others as the object. In truth, there is only one consciousness, Brahman, Atman, the Supreme Self, experiencing its own divine play through all of us. But in our unenlightened state, we live in a world of complex human relationships, all reacting to one another's reactions to our reactions to them. Such unchecked patterns of thought and behavior can devalue us all. We need to become aware of each person in front of us as a person. Have you ever really looked into the eyes of a person who you feel does not belong to your own social, economic, cultural, or intellectual sphere? Someone who you feel is very different from you. Were you able to find shining from that person's eyes the same light that you know shines from yours? Such a moment brings the instantaneous recognition of a shared humanity, and beyond that of a shared divinity. This experience is possible whenever we engage face to face with those who do not look like us, who do not speak like us, and who have different customs or lifestyles from ours. Any aversion you may have felt in the past will dissolve in an instant, and in that moment of recognition that we are all the same divine consciousness, you will become empathetic, compassionate, and more fully alive. Now this sounds like really contemporary philosophy, doesn't it? I'm going to read a verse that's 3,000 years old, again from the Ishopanishad. Yas tu sarvani bhutani atmanyeva nupashyati sarva bhuteshu chatmanam tatona vijigupsate. One who perceives all beings in the self, and the self in all beings, thus shrinks away from nothing. To conclude, we cannot accept the premise that what happens in meditation stays in meditation. Once we've been there, we can learn to let ourselves let that inner light flow outward into our daily lives. The more we integrate our consciousness, the closer we approach to the indescribable oneness that is our true original nature. As oneness, it's not just within, it's out there as well. As we bring increased awareness to all the ways we think, act, and relate to others, all the moments of ordinary living can be refashioned and transformed into uninterrupted spiritual practice, into truly conscious living. Ardvam jwalati jyotiraham jyotir jwalati brahmahamasmi, yohamasmi brahmahamasmi, ahamasmi brahmahamasmi, ahamevahamam juhomi swa. The light within me shines, I am the light. The light that shines brightly, I am that Brahman. I am that. That which I am is nothing but Brahman. I am, and I am Brahman. I myself offer myself into the infinite light, which is myself. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace.